Thank you, Radhika, and thank you, comrades, for the invitation to join you today, since we're marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. I'd like to start by sending particular solidarity greetings to all comrades here from China and Russia. I would rather say China and Soviet comrades, but here we are. And those two states, two peoples that bore the brunt of that struggle. Now, today we regard the Second World War predominantly as an anti-fascist war, and of course that has a substantial degree of truth in it, as we've already heard. However, I want to look at this more specifically from the point of view of the conduct of the British ruling class, of British imperialism at the time, and its distinctly not anti-fascist orientation, because I think that has some relevance for both world politics today and for the question of whether we are talking about a revival of fascism now. Powell underlined very usefully some of the revisionism that goes on regarding the war. There are also, of course, other examples which are perhaps better described as myths, which are particularly deeply baked into Britain's political culture. Britain, of course, is seen as a good guy in the war, and that is more or less where it ended up, through no thanks to its own efforts. But it conceals a lot of complexity. The first myth, perhaps, is that Britain had very little or limited responsibility for the war, and that its mistakes were largely those of what's called appeasement. In fact, while Britain was not, of course, a fascist state in the 1930s, or so far ever, it was nevertheless, as it went into the war, at the helm of an empire that held hundreds of millions of people in conditions of extreme authoritarianism, buttressing official racism. If it's true, as Powell and others have outlined, that Nazism represented the return of colonial methods to Europe, the British Empire also represented, to some extent, the export of fascist measures of rule to the colonies. And Britain's foreign policy was not based on being rather weak-minded and almost pacifist and failing to stand up to Hitler. It was dominated by the twin priorities of defending a massively overextended colonial empire against all comers, and on diverting Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. These were its objectives, and they led, of course, to the sacrifice of Czechoslovakia, and they persisted even after the outbreak of war, when, as we know, the British and French military took no measures at all against Nazi Germany to assist Poland, the ostensible reason for declaring war, and yet there was Operation Pike was developed, which was to launch an assault on the oil industry in the Soviet Union, instead to further anti-Soviet imperialist objectives. The second myth is that Churchill was, even if conservative, a profoundly anti-fascist politician. I mean, this is not true either. He was on the record as being a great admirer of Mussolini. In the Spanish Civil War, he was more inclined to support Francoism than the Republic. And throughout the Second World War, there are numerous examples of his extreme racism with regard to the Indian people. Of course, it was Indian and other people, I should say, and of course his willingness to buttress authoritarianism in Greece in the face of a popular movement of resistance led by the Communist Party. Of course, Hitler was anti-Nazi because of the threat Nazism posed to the British Empire, and admittedly because of some of its excessive measures, excessive by any standards. But Churchill was not motivated by anti-fascism. And the British war strategy was not, as conceived by the ruling class, a war for democracy. It was again a war dictated by imperial strategy, by hanging on to colonial possessions, particularly in Asia and the Asian theatre of war. Priorities, military priorities, were dictated not by assisting the Soviet Union or the popular struggle against the Nazis in Europe, but by advancing British military in North Africa, the Balkans, and elsewhere, where it met British imperial interests. And the war, as the war ended, there was another military plan, Operation Unthinkable, which was actually to mobilize British and American forces and reconstituted German forces almost before Hitler was cold in his grave for war against the Soviet Union. I mention all this because the war was a complicated war. It's not a, there is no such thing as I think as a pure war. There are always cross-cutting interests, different class interests involved, different perspectives. But the idea of British imperialism fighting a pure anti-fascist war is, I believe, a myth. It's even clearer if one looks at the war in Asia, where there was the mighty struggle of the Chinese people against Japanese aggression, but there was also basically an inter-imperialist conflict between the defensive powers like Britain, colonial powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, the rising power of expanding power of Japan and of the USA, and the war ended with British imperialism hiring the troops of Japanese imperialism to reimpose the rule of French imperialism on the Vietnamese people. So again, well, as we mark the end of the war, these complexities have to be acknowledged. And I think there is some relevance to the world today. Of course, there's not time to go into a full review, but we see how British imperialism has, over the last 3 years, played arguably a leading role in the world in trying to prolong the conflict in Ukraine, to obstruct any possible moves towards peace, for a very bellicose policy. We also see it in the fact that there is even now a disagreement between the British government and the Americans. And the American government, the Trump administration, is saying Britain should concentrate its military efforts on Europe, and that we are sending one of the 2 aircraft carriers in the British Navy to the Far East as part of provocations directed against China, asserting British imperialism's continued aspiration to play a global role. Now, whether we are seeing fascism now or some variation of right-wing authoritarianism, we can be sure of one thing, I think, that this phenomenon arises from similar roots as in the 1930s, that is to say, the deepening economic crisis since 2008 and the bankers' crash, from which the British economy and others have never really recovered, a generation of stagnant and falling living standards for the working class people, the degradation of public services. All of this fuels the discontent. And if we look at the rise of the far-right parties across Europe, at the phenomenon of Trump in the USA, really these were, if not negligible, at least very much reduced before 2008. They were a product of economic crisis in a number of capitalist countries, and also of a globally sharpened competition, with the anxieties of American imperialism and its allies being driven by the rise of China as now a great socialist power. So we have to look at it in that context. And I think we have to be maybe an element of caution as to how we relate fascism to other political phenomena that we are seeing. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a series of aggressive neo-colonial wars. I'm thinking of obviously Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya primarily. These have all been launched by forces that are broadly, generically described as centrist liberalism. And it's also the centrist liberalisms whose failures and bankruptcies have domestically, in clinging to neoliberalism, a zombie neoliberalism, have powered the rise of the far right. And of course, although it is only demagogy to a large extent, parties like Reform, politicians like Trump, pose as peace lovers, as being definitely less aggressive than the neoconservatives and neoliberals who preceded them, who have authored all these wars and who continue, Starmer, Macron, Merz now in Germany, in the vanguard of trying to prolong the conflict in Ukraine. So we have to be cautious, I think, of reading over strategies from the 1930s to today. Of course, our Danish comrade is absolutely right to have raise the importance of alliances based around the working class, with communists playing the leading role as to the extent of their capacities. But we also have to acknowledge that it is the liberals who would perhaps, under some circumstances, be seen as our allies, who have hugely discredited themselves with the popular masses of people, and whose policies have led to war and social misery. And I think also, while it's absolutely right to remember the Popular Front strategy and its vitality and the gains it registered at the time, we also have to acknowledge that its initiation by the communist movement in the 1930s led to something of a reduction in emphasis on the anti-colonial struggle across the world at the time. And while that, of course, is a matter of historical debate, I think the centering of the struggles of the global South and of the role of People's China in resisting the rise of the far right is important. And it's also important not to allow anti-fascism to be mobilized against anti-imperialism, as has happened in sections of the left over this century, where the centrists dubbed somebody, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Slobodan Milosevic or Bashir Assad, as the new Hitler, and elements of the left then say we have to support these wars because we are fighting against fascism. And therefore anti-fascism gets perverted into fighting anti-imperialism. We have to emphasize absolutely that fascism is an excrescence of the imperialist world system, and any ally against imperialism is our ally against fascism today. Thank you, comrades.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.